So good afternoon, everyone. So nice to see you so numerous. I'm very glad. I'm Antonia Alampi, and I'm one of the curators of Kunsthal Extra City, but also the curator of this specific project, which, as I'm sure now you probably know, given you're here, is titled On Monumental Silences, and it's a new project by artist Ibrahim Mahama. And we'll have, in the course of the afternoon, time to delve more into that specific project. I'll give a very brief introduction to give a general idea of what we will actually be discussing today with the various speakers. As you know, the subject of discussion is essentially problematic monuments still standing in public space in Antwerp, Belgium, and more globally. And just last week, on the 16th of January, we actually had a 5 hours ongoing performative action / discussion on this subject, and particularly looking into the image of Father Constant the Deacon that you see just there, and basically what to do with it. What is this image? Trying to deconstruct it and dissect it, and thinking about what new images can we actually produce, taking that as a starting point. Somehow this afternoon today somehow picks up, I think, of where we left the conversation there, which is that we reached a kind of general consensus on the fact that the image is, in fact, problematic and racist and offensive and violent. What, though, essentially is the maybe more difficult series of questions is, what do we actually do with those images? And I think it is these questions that we will look into today. Is providing context via text, via plaque that essentially tells the story, contextualizes enough? Can an image actually compete with text? Or another point that was raised the other time, should we actually move these monuments and these images somewhere else, where more context can actually be provided? And what should this somewhere else be? Should it be a museum? And in that case, what museum? Or should we think about other dispositives in which these images should actually end up? Or third or fourth option, should we actually erect counter monuments to them? New monuments, new images that can actually have even just the visual capacity to compete with the past, so to speak, and provide what is also a question. Provide the different versions of that story that actually exist. Provide a new image that it can be an image that represents the values in which a new society in 2017 is based on. And I guess, these are the questions that I feel will just be very present in most of the presentations via a number of different speakers. I'll introduce our first ones. First of all, thank you so much for being here. Our first speaker is Sara Weyns. She's the director of the Middelheim Museum, which is a very important institution within the subject, because it is a sculpture park. It owns a collection of sculptures and monuments, but also it does have a role in terms of, at least an advisory role in terms of, municipal decisions in terms of public monuments. And then after her, we will have Bambi Ceuppens, who is the chief curator and researcher at the Royal African Museum of Tervuren, which has come up also various times during the discussion last week as a possible place where maybe this type of images, artifacts, monuments, propaganda images could potentially maybe be in the future. But I'll also read you the longer version of their biography nonetheless. So Sara Weyns joined the Middelheim team as a curator and exhibition maker in 2005. Exhibitions at the Hessenhuis, the Middelheim Museum, and in public space, both locally and internationally, followed from extensive collaborations with artists such as Chris Burden, Paul McCarthy, Andrea Zittel, Peter Rogers, Kadra Tia, Marvin Gaye Chetwind, Richard Deacon, and many others. Almost always, these artists create new works for the project, for the museum, or for the location in public space. Since January 2014, Sara has been the director of the Middelheim Museum. Together with the team, she hopes to create a motivation to understand contemporary sculpture through the quality of its experience. Thus, a support for the visual arts can be consolidated, allowing the public to share a responsibility for it and to encourage others to do the same. And this, I think, is an important aspect that came out, last week again. It's like, how can we engage different communities in determining what these new sculptures and new monuments should actually be, what they should represent, and what stories they should tell. Bambi Ceuppens studied African languages and history at the State University of Ghent and cultural social anthropology at the Catholic University of Leuven. She received her PhD in social anthropology from the University of St. Andrews. She has taught postdoctoral researchers at Ghent University, the Catholic University of Leuven, and the Royal Museum for Central Africa. Currently a senior researcher and curator at the Royal Museum for Central Africa, Bambi Ceuppens' research focuses on the colonial history that the Congo and Belgium share. Congolese popular and contemporary arts and cultures, Congolese in Belgium, museum representations of Africans and autochthony. She has curated a number of temporary exhibitions and is the general curator of humanities and social sciences of the new permanent exhibition at the Royal Museum of Central Africa. The way we always have 20 minutes presentation each and then space for discussion and questions from you. Sara, thank you for being here.
Thank you for this nice introduction. Okay, let me test this. Can everybody hear me okay? Does this work, kind of? Can you hear me? Okay. First of all, I'm going to do this talk in English, but I could understand maybe there are some people for whom Dutch is the first language, so if there's something unclear or not comfortable, please just shout out and I will translate. Yeah? All right. First, I'll quickly try to explain what I'm doing here and what the role of the Middelheim Museum is. Antonia has already introduced this a little bit. Then I'll quickly try to draw a line around the subject matter of my talk so we know what we're talking about. And thirdly, I will probably already exhaust you, and in that sense, I'm not the most fortunate first speaker perhaps, with several series of questions that will give you a sense of the kinds of problems we are facing when we are facing the idea of the monument today. This will, I think, give you some context to the discussion around the subject matter that Ibrahim and Antonia have put on the table here at Extra City. Okay, why am I sitting here? What does Middelheim Museum has to do with monuments? Well, together with the Patrimony Maintenance Department, we take care of the collection of artworks in public space in the city of Antwerp, from the contemporary ones to the 19th century ones. And as a part of that assignment, we try to develop for the city of Antwerp a strategy or a methodology to deal with questions of loss of meaning, loss of ethical, artistic, spatial, social value, loss of material value sometimes. This is a very slow and tricky process because we quickly see that in an administrative and political context, people are not used to addressing these issues. We also often give advice on how conservation problems can be tackled, preferably also prevented. And we conduct research into the relationship between sculpture and art in public space, and the collection in Middelheim goes from Rodin to the present, so from the moment that traditional monuments were questioned by the artists. We also arose as an institution shortly after World War II, when after the disappointments of that Second World War, sculpture gave up the belief in the classical monument. So these problems are very much in the DNA of the museum. And as Antonia said, we are very often advisors for the creation of new art for the city of Antwerp. And in that respect, we will be working together with Extra City in the next few years to come to proposals to turn the classical chain of command upside down. Usually it goes like this. A local government thinks this would be a nice place to have a new artistic creation. And then best practice is that they find a mediator. The mediator kind of brings all the stakeholders around the table. They select an artist and the artist goes to work. And what we would like to do with Extra City in the next few years is try to turn that upside down and to find out what artists put on the table as necessary locations or issues to deal with in public space. So, it's not a completely new model. They do it in France as well, but one that has interesting potential. So that's one. Two, what can be regarded as a monument? And I think it is useful to consider kind of a delineation of the subject for the sake of this conversation. We will call a monument a mark, often a work of art, but not always. A monument can also be a forest, a memorial stone, a building, a square, a street. So not all monuments are art. And not all art in public space, of course, is a monument. But the artworks that are, and they are traditionally sculptural, are designed and placed A, to remember something or someone, B, of which it is assumed by the commissioner that it offers visitors or spectators the opportunity to find comfort or to show respect, and C, that it concerns something that needs to be remembered for future generations. Now, the observation that can be made here is that monuments are in trouble. They are either meaningless by lack of knowledge, people just don't know anymore what they stand for, or they are losing their meaning in terms of support systems for the message they represent. And that brings us to the third part, a whole wide spread of questions that are being voiced from different angles. As Antonia said, the debate around monuments is topical, and as far as I'm concerned, a very interesting one too, a necessary one too. I'd like to share some of these questions with you, because as you will see, that to come to an inventory of questions is a complex exercise in itself, and one that needs to precede the inventory of possible conclusions or solutions. And as an answer to these questions, I'll also give some possible yes or no options, but I do so only as a rhetoric trick, because the most interesting answers will be a third option or a fourth one. And these third and fourth and fifth possible options are being formulated by artists such as Ibrahim today. But this way we'll have a starting point for the conversation later. First set of questions. Why are we having this discussion? What is interesting about monuments today anyway? What makes them valuable? What makes them vulnerable for that loss of value? We already talked about a monument's potential to point to something worth noticing and to offer the opportunity to share what is thought of important to remember for future generations. And this seems a simple enough notion, but you can split this thought up into a whole list of aspects that together make the meaning of this object. Archaeological value, architectural value, artistic value, cultural value, aesthetic value, historic value, technical value maybe, spatially structuring value, social value, urbanist value, scientific value, folkloristic value. Maybe we can think of some more, but if we recognize the complex entanglement of those, how do we outweigh those different aspects? In the case of a single object, how can we find a way to place, for instance, something with a low social meaning next to a high local cultural one? Or how can we place a high aesthetic meaning next to a low historic value? Brings us to set of questions number 2. Should we remove monuments that have become highly problematic, both in intent and or in visual appearance? And then related are other questions. What's the tipping point? How do we measure the support for a public monument? And how do you make those disrespected by it heard? Possible answers could be, no, you don't remove them. It's a memory track. Heritage cannot be touched. Removing them would be a falsification of history. Or, yes, please remove them, because culture and heritage as a part of it is alive and changeable and must be able to adapt to the needs of society today. And if we would decide to move them, should we destroy them? Or should we keep them somewhere? Could we move it to the museum, as Antonia suggested? Because after all, museums offer a good place to bring together different opinions and experiences into contact with one another. And they can be framed and challenged by visitors, but also, for instance, by contemporary artists. And if we would decide to keep them, should we conserve them? And if we would decide to keep them in the space where they are, in public space, should we conserve them, but provide additional information for interpretation? And this is what happened in the case of the subject matter that Ibrahim is addressing. Or should we leave them, but not conserve them, and leave them to the elements in public space? Maybe let them extinguish, be grown over with moss and vandalized maybe. All those questions are valid ones, and before we can answer those, a whole new set of questions appears at the horizon. Because if you choose to move them to the museum, do you move the problem? Are our museums not also public space? And if they are not public space, is removing them not a neutralizing of the public problem that we urgently need to address as a public? Is it possible to learn to live together with visual markings from the past that are problematic? Can they be reinterpreted maybe as warnings instead of commemorations? Or on the other hand, does it make sense to leave those scars visible if you can also remove them? Why would we assume that we forget what they commemorated when we no longer see them? Will we forget to tell future generations, for instance, that we were once a colonizing nation when we no longer see these works like Pater de Deken in Wilrijk? Can or should we come up with a system of prioritizing the monuments up for debate? For instance, is the removal of figurative racist monuments like this one more urgent than the abstract ones commemorating the same colonialism that are, for instance, in the city park here in Antwerp? Are monuments the only public signposts in the city that should be considered in that sense? What about names of buildings like Katoennazi, for instance, or street names, or the shape and form of the Antwerp harbor? So as I said, the questions are many and they are complex. And it is not so strange that it is hard to find public policy administrators to declare themselves willing to open these cans of worms. It takes time and a lot of thinking. And these are only the questions that deal with the existing monuments, because an equally interesting debate can be held when you look towards the future. And that brings us to a third set of questions. Is a new monument for a current topic or an issue still possible today? And what stories, values, or messages could contemporary monuments carry out? Should they be able to go on for 100 years? Are they for the next generations or not? And you could say, no, it's not possible to make monuments today because a monument requires consensus about who or what deserves a monument, and that is not possible today in our hyper-diverse and very vocal society. Our governments are aware of this, and thus they reject the commissioning of new monuments. Or you could say, yes, we can still make monuments because monuments were never placed from consensus among the citizens, but from the vision of the commissioner, the prevailing politics. And that is no different today. It's just a matter of grabbing the microphone. And then there are yet again multiple next questions. Where again is the tipping point? Does it take only one person with an idea? Do you need a minimal support system for the meaning of these new monuments? How do you create that? And how do you prevent that opening up the public participation, for instance, will lead to a bland flavor of consensus art? Here too, opinions are divided. But, and here's the bright side, if you need it, it is here that we can start listening to the contemporary artists and see if they can come up with artworks that can address these complex problems, like we do here today. Thank you.